Right, good evening and a very warm welcome, dear colleagues and guests joining here in Singapore, as well as joining us online from all around the world. My name is Althaf Marsoof, and I'm an associate professor and the deputy head of the Division of Business Law at the Nanyang Business School. And it is my absolute pleasure and privilege to be your host this evening. On behalf of the Nanyang Business School, the United Nations supported principles for responsible investment and the European Corporate Governance Institute, it is my pleasure to warmly welcome you to this third lecture of the NBS-PRI-ECGI public lecture series on sustainable business. This lecture series launched in 2025 as a global initiative bringing together academic practitioners and policymakers to explore cutting-edge issues intersecting in areas such as corporate governance, sustainability, and responsible business. The series aims to facilitate meaningful knowledge exchange between research and practice in the field of sustainable business, and we host 8 lectures each year, with each session featuring a talk by a leading scholar, followed by a moderated discussion by an industry expert, helping to connect rigorous academic insights with real-world experience. And at this stage, I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge Assistant Professor Yusia Azur, the faculty lead for this lecture series, whose leadership has been instrumental to bring this dialogue to Nanyang Business School. So to extend the impact of these conversations, recordings of these lectures and event summaries are shared online, creating a global public knowledge library on sustainable business. If you missed any of our earlier events, please take some time to look at the YouTube channel and summaries on the ECGI blog. So now to formally open this evening's session, it is my pleasure to invite Associate Professor Victor Yeo, the head of the Division of Business Law, for his opening remarks. Victor, over to you.
Thank you very much, Althaf. And I would like to echo Althaf's warm welcome to each and every one of you. For those of you who are able to join us in person, welcome to our beautiful campus. And for those of you who are joining us online, we look forward to welcoming you at some point in time as well in the immediate future. Now, this is a very special period for us at Nanyang Business School as we mark our 30th anniversary, a milestone that reflects 3 decades of developing business leaders and advancing research that speaks to the challenges shaping global markets and institutions. Now, tonight's lecture reflects that mission. It explores a question linked to a fundamental concept of the modern corporation: the separation of ownership and control. And to what extent should and can shareholders shape corporate decisions? Well, investors today care not only about financial returns. They also want to engage companies on things like governance standards and environmental and sustainability issues, amongst other things. Shareholders are increasingly raising their concerns on these issues, seeking not only dialogue, but also to perhaps influence corporate strategies in relation to these matters. Of course, the intensity of shareholder activism varies significantly across jurisdictions, driven by various factors including culture and the legal rights accorded to shareholders. In markets such as the United States and the United Kingdom, activism is relatively strong. In other regions, including parts of Asia and continental Europe, where ownership structures tend to be more concentrated, shareholder activism has historically been more limited. Even so, this is gradually evolving. Regardless of these differences, regulators, scholars, and business leaders confront the same challenges. How do we strike the right balance between giving shareholders a voice and governing the corporation effectively? Completely ignoring shareholder voice risks weakening accountability and may raise allegations of oppression by the board or by the majority shareholders. But permitting too much intervention may risk undermining the board's ability to manage a corporation effectively and perhaps even result in the tyranny of the minority. On what issues do shareholders wish to have a say? How effective are existing mechanisms in giving shareholders a meaningful opportunity to be heard? Do shareholders really need a formal avenue to raise their concerns given other methods of drawing attention to these issues today, such as through social media? Tonight's lecture explores some of these questions in the context of the use of shareholder proposals in the US. And we are especially fortunate to have with us Professor Adriana Robertson to share her insights and research on this topic. Her work offers a valuable perspective on how shareholder voice operates in practice and what it means for the evolving relationship between investors, boards, and corporations. Thank you all for joining us, and I wish everyone an engaging and thought-provoking evening ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor, for those thoughtful opening remarks and for setting the stage for today's session. We now turn to the main feature of this evening, and it is my great pleasure to introduce our academic speaker, Professor Adriana Robertson, Donald N. Pritzker Professor of Business Law at the University of Chicago. Professor Robertson is a leading scholar in corporate and securities law with particular expertise in shareholder rights and corporate governance. Her work has been widely cited by academics, policymakers, market participants, and we are definitely very delighted and pleased to have her with us this evening. In today's lecture, titled Shareholder Proposals, Past, Present, and Future, Professor Robertson will take us through the historical evolution of shareholder proposals, assess their current role amid regulatory and political shifts, and reflect on what the future may hold for this important governance mechanism. So we are delighted to have her with us this evening. Professor Robertson, the floor is yours.
I'm going to do the little necklaces thing. That way I can't possibly drop it. Oh. Check. Cool. All right. 1 second. So I don't go over time. Well, thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be here in beautiful Singapore and to have this opportunity to participate in this august lecture series. So I'm here to talk about shareholder proposals. They've become a real focal point of corporate governance in the United States over the last several years. A wide variety of investors have made use of them to influence corporate behavior. Right? And when you stop to think about it, it's an astonishing thing, right? A 500-word request filed by a tiny shareholder can force a Fortune 100 company's board to respond publicly and sometimes lead it to change course entirely. Right? That's what we're talking about with shareholder proposals. This is a graph of the number of shareholder proposals that actually went to a vote at S&P 1500 companies between 2019 and 2024. Right? So as you can see, right, that's 600 at the top there. That's a pretty significant phenomenon that we're talking about. Now, a brief word on my perspective here. I've been studying shareholder proposals for several years. I'm at a law school, but I'm also an empiricist, so I'm kind of a law and finance scholar, as you heard. And so mostly what I want to do is just understand the world. Right? I'm not here to advocate for any particular position. To the extent that I have a normative position, it's that I want us to have well-functioning capital markets. And other than that, you know, that's up to everybody else to fight over what that means. So with all of that in mind, I have noticed that shareholder proposals are something of a Rorschach test, right? Like an inkblot test. So supporters of sustainability and ESG investing argue that they're a crucial means of affecting change at corporations. Anti-ESG proponents have discovered that they can also be a tool to push back against what they see as objectionable behavior at corporations. Skeptics think that the entire process has become a costly distraction, and regulators are actively considering making significant changes to the process. And the reality is that in their current form, as they've existed for the last couple of years, shareholder proposals are simultaneously a corporate governance mechanism, a disclosure/market information mechanism, and a public contestation venue, right? That's the ESG versus anti-ESG on the political, social, environmental side, right? There are all three of these things at the same time. So who cares and who should care? Well, a bunch of different people, given what I just said, right? So for investors, they're a tool that can move disclosure and governance even when it doesn't win at the ballot box. Right? On the other hand, there are plenty of investors, mostly certain types of institutional investors, that are skeptical of the economic case behind some of these types of proposals. Right? They sometimes see this as a nuisance, right? At best, and at worst, a costly distraction. For companies and for boards, they're a recurring governance and reputational workflow. It's something they have to deal with, often resolved through dialogue and withdrawal rather than a vote. This, too, is a double-edged sword. So, on the one hand, it's a low-cost way for boards to surface investor concerns and to take the temperature of investors on a wide range of topics. On the other hand, it's yet another thing to juggle in a really busy proxy season. Right? It's both. For activists, it's a really low-cost way of getting your message out. Right? Like we said, a tiny investor can force a multi-trillion-dollar corporation to carry its message on its proxy. Right? For policymakers, the shareholder proposal rule sits at the juncture of federal securities law and state corporate law. Shifts in either domain will then shift the rules of the game. Right? So the policy has varied over the years. I think it's fair to say that the prior administration in the United States made it easier to bring shareholder proposals, specifically proposals related to social and policy issues. The pendulum has swung back, I think that's also fair to say, in recent years, right? And these changes in policy have understandably led to anxiety and consternation in some circles. Given the signals that we're seeing, it's fair to say that there may be more changes to come. And so I thought this would be a good opportunity to take a step back and to think holistically about the shareholder proposal process. Right? So that's kind of what I want to do tonight. Okay? So here's the main thing that I want you to take away if you get tired and start playing with your phone after this. Shareholder proposals are a governance process. Right? That's their job. They exist to facilitate corporate governance rights that already exist under corporate law, which in the United States is a completely separate body of law from the securities laws that the SEC manages. Right? So they've provided one process through which shareholders can exercise those rights. Right? And given all of that, the vote itself is just one part of a much larger process, and indeed a pretty small part of that much larger process. Right? So changes mean that that landscape is shifting. But whatever happens, the mechanisms of corporate governance will continue to evolve and adapt to changes in both the regulatory and the market environment. So again, shareholder proposals are just one tool in the governance toolkit, and there are many other ways for shareholders to exercise their rights. So here's what I want to talk about for the next 45 minutes or so before we get to the Q&A. I'll start with a brief background about shareholder proposals in the US capital market and how that all works. And then with apologies to Taylor Swift, I want to talk briefly about 3 eras of shareholder proposals. Okay? Then I'll take a half step back and I'll talk about the world that we've all become used to using a concrete case study. So I'll talk about political proposals. And finally, I'll give you some thoughts about the future. Now, I don't have a crystal ball or anything like that, but the SEC has given some pretty clear signals, at least of the directions in which it's thinking. And even more importantly, I want to think about the future in the context of the broad range of governance tools that exist wholly apart from the shareholder proposal rule. Okay. So that's sort of what I'm thinking for the next 45 minutes or so. Okay. So let's start. As a governance tool, shareholder proposals are unique in a variety of ways. So first, as we said, even tiny shareholders can bring them. So right now, you need to have held $2,000 in shares for 3 years, and you can put this on the ballot, right? If you've had it for less time, you need a slightly higher threshold. It goes up. Right? Now, assuming that the proposal satisfies the SEC's rules, the company is required to include the proponent's 500-word proposal text on its proxy, and it is required to ask shareholders to vote on it. Historically, much of the action here was around proxy advisor recommendations. In particular, sophisticated proponents aim to craft their proposals in such a way that proxy advisors would recommend voting in favor, right? Because so many investors tended to follow those recommendations, right? That was a really useful way to run up the yes vote. Now, it's really, really hard to find settings where it's possible to study the causal impact of shareholder proposals, right? Why? Well, they don't get filed randomly and the votes don't happen randomly. But notwithstanding this, I think it's fair to say that both anecdotal evidence and what empirical scholarly evidence we have suggests that they're doing something, right? They have some impact. Now, not all the evidence necessarily suggests that that impact is good, but there is some evidence that they are doing something, right? Now, importantly, really importantly, most proposals are precatory, right? What does that mean? They're requests, right? Partly because of corporate law, right, which we'll come to. What that means is they're just suggestions. Right? That's what we're talking about when we talk about shareholder proposals. And we'll loop back to this shortly. Okay, but before I do that, a little bit of table setting about how this process actually works. Okay? So the first step is that a shareholder writes the proposal in the supporting statement, right, and submits it by the deadline. Right? And as we said, they're short, 500 words. Then the company decides whether to try to seek exclusion, whether they want to say, we don't need to carry this on our proxy. Now, historically, the way this happened was that the company would seek no action relief from the SEC. Right? The company would write to the SEC and explain why the company thought that the proposal doesn't comply with the rules. If the SEC agreed, then it would write back. And it would say, yep, we agree with your analysis. If you exclude this proposal, we will take no action against you, the company. There were a variety of different grounds that you could use to exclude a proposal. Not following the procedural rules, you missed the deadline, you didn't hold enough shares, things like that. It was false or misleading. Substantial implementation, we already did that, or it's duplicative of something else. And then there's the more interesting ones, things like it's messing with our ordinary business, or it's not economically relevant. And then finally, it's not a proper subject for action by shareholders under state corporate law. Now, importantly, those exclusion decisions are deeply shaped by staff guidance at the SEC, how the rules are actually being interpreted, right, at that point in time. Okay? Now, assuming that the proposal was not excluded, okay, then the company would meet with the proponent and negotiate. At that stage, withdrawal and settlement is common. Now, assuming you don't get a settlement and you don't get a withdrawal, what's going to happen? Well, the proxy statement is going to be filed publicly with that proposal on it. Right? So everyone in the world is going to see the proposal and the supporting statement. The company is going to include its response as well. Shareholders are going to vote on it. Right? And then I guess we get the aftermath. Right? The vote happens. Most proposals are asking for some form of disclosure or for management to consider some policy change. Right? And so if that doesn't materialize after a significant amount of support, then there may be something else in the future, either some future proposal or some escalation. Okay. So, importantly, right, let's zoom in on this precatory piece. Right? We said that they're just requests. They're not binding. Because of that, passing and failing are kind of meaningless, right? Formally, from a legal perspective, there's no difference between a proposal that got 1% support and a proposal that got 99% support, because either way, it's a suggestion, right? It's a request. Why? Why does it happen that way? Well, it's because of those grounds for exclusion I told you about before. And in particular, that last one about not a proper subject for action by shareholders. And this goes to what Victor was alluding to about the role of the board versus the role of shareholders, right? So state corporate law vests managerial control and authority with the board, not the shareholders, right? And so this board-centric allocation of authority makes it difficult for shareholders to mandate specific actions. You can ask the board to consider doing something, but you can't make them do something. Why? Because it's the board that runs the company, not the shareholders. Right? And so it has been thought to be okay to make a request or a recommendation, right? But it has not been thought to be okay to do more than that. Right? So yes, a relatively small number of shareholder proposals do do binding things like bylaw amendments. Let's bracket those. Those aren't the types of shareholder proposals that people are interested in when they're talking about sustainability anyway. I want to focus on the ones that are related to the topic of this lecture series. Right? Now, to be clear, just because they're not binding, it doesn't mean they're not influential. So first, a shareholder vote does act as a barometer of shareholder interest. If 99% of your shareholders want you to do something, the boards are probably going to listen. If only 1% of your shareholders ask you to do something, they may well ignore you. That's not because it's binding, it's because it's telling you something about what your investors care about. Boards are often going to want to be responsive to their owners, right? That's kind of like the carrot, right? Doing what your investors like. There's also a stick. Right? So traditionally, that's come from the proxy advisors, ISS and Glass Lewis. So historically, they have treated strong prior year shareholder support as a board responsiveness issue. Right? So often, what that's going to do is it's going to shift scrutiny from the proposal itself to director accountability if the board doesn't respond. Okay, last piece of table setting. In the United States, we have a federalist system, so each state makes its own laws related to certain subjects. One of those subjects is corporate law. And the big fish in this space is, of course, Delaware. Delaware corporate law makes law for most of the country, most of the big corporations, at least, in the country. That's where this proper subject comes from in those rules that I mentioned. So shareholder proposals sit at the intersection, right, of securities law and corporate law. So for public companies, securities law governs the process of shareholder voting, right? Things like the timing of when a proposal has to be distributed, the manner in which it has to be made available, things like that. State corporate law, on the other hand, defines the substance of corporate governance, right? This includes the scope of the board power and the rights that shareholders have. So what does that mean? The shareholder proposal rule cannot give shareholders more rights than they had at corporate law to begin with. All it does is facilitate their use of the mechanisms that exist. So at the end of the day, it's going to the state corporate law, right, that's making the ultimate decisions here. Okay? That's our proper subject business back again. Okay? So what state corporate law allows, the federal proxy rules can facilitate access to, but not more than that. Right? So we'll return to that. One way to think about it, another way to frame it if you're not familiar with this idea, state law, what shareholders and boards can do substantively, securities law, how dispersed owners can communicate and vote, right, to those boards. And the shareholder proposal rule is the bridge between those two things. Right? That bridge has been re-engineered and is being re-engineered, and this is not the first time that that's happened. Okay? So instead, we've seen evolutions in the way this bridge works over many years. Right? So let's start with the early days of shareholder proposals. So the shareholder proposal rule actually goes back to the 1940s. Right? 1942. We don't really think of it as being mostly a modern phenomenon, but it's been around on the books for a long, long time. So, start with what I call the governance era. Renee Jones has a fantastic account of this in a speech she gave when she was the director of CorpFin, which I commend to you. So, we start in 1942. The early years were largely focused on classic bread and butter agency cost topics, right? What sometimes gets called traditional governance. That's why I'm calling it traditional governance here. So if you look at annual reports from this period, the number of proposals crept up over time, but generally stayed below 100 or so for the first decades of the rule. Gradually, tensions began to arise about what belongs in this disclosure governance rubric and what's more social policy. So this started back in the 70s. And so two well-known examples that I've just highlighted on the slide here. Dow Chemical was the first one. So shareholders submitted a proposal at Dow Chemical asking the board to amend the company's charter to prohibit the sale of napalm. Right? This was during the Vietnam War. Right? That was an early social-based shareholder proposal. In response to litigation over this, the SEC concluded that ordinary business operations could include certain matters which have significant policy, economic, or other implications inherent to them. That was an early decision related to these, what we might now today call ESG. Then in the 90s, this came up again at Cracker Barrel. So Cracker Barrel needed a proposal asking the board to implement non-discriminatory employment policies. It was sued, it ultimately won, but people were unhappy with that result. And because of that unhappiness, the SEC revised its approach in 1998, and it amended the rule. Right? So companies could no longer exclude proposals related to sufficiently significant social policy issues because they would transcend day-to-day business matters. That's the sort of framework. So that 1998 revision set the stage for the evolution of the shareholder proposal framework towards this significant social impact stuff. That's the way we more think of it today. Now, of course, this was taken a step further in 2021. So big picture, the staff legal bulletin reframed the application of key exclusion bases in a way that was widely understood to open the door even further to E&S proposals. Now, by the time of that staff legal bulletin in 2021, we were well into what I would call the disclosure sustainability era. I would loosely date this from about the mid-2010s or so through the early 2020s. So in this era, shareholder proposals were routinely focused on disclosure, often with respect to social and environmental issues. This is also where we start to see the dueling framings that I think we're now very familiar with. Are concerns about greenhouse gas emissions best understood as concerns about financial risk and return, or are they really about social responsibility? Right? That's the sort of thing that we're now very familiar with. Right? So this is the same figure I showed you at the very beginning of the talk. Right? We have traditional governance proposals holding roughly steady. Right? They didn't really go up in that period, but the E&S proposals, environmental and social, they rose dramatically in the same time period. Right, so these cover a really broad range of topics. Environment could be things like climate, although not always, could be other things too. Social proposals are often things like racial justice issues, things like human rights, political activities and lobbying also fall in there. Okay. Now, those were the proposals that actually went to a vote at S&P 1500 companies, but looking at voted proposals only tells you part of the story. So this is from a chapter that my frequent co-author Jill Fish and I wrote on this topic a couple of years ago. This is zooming in on proposals seeking sustainability disclosures, really in the middle of this period, right in the heyday of this era of proposals. Right? And so we see that it's not enough to just look at the voted proposals in the light blue. The ones that were withdrawn, i.e. settled, that are shown in green here, are actually a really significant number. So more proposals seeking environmental sustainability were actually settled than went to a vote. Right? With the social, it's not as big, but it's still a really big chunk. Right? These proposals were also getting significant amounts of support, so even if you just look at the voted proposals, because of course if they were settled, no vote ever happened, so I don't have a vote outcome to show you. Right? But even looking here, we can see that there's a significant number of these proposals that were getting something in the 30 to 50% range. That means a significant chunk of investors said yes, they wanted this thing. Once you add all those withdrawn proposals, then you see actually there's significant support for these proposals, again, during the heyday of that disclosure era. Now these charts, of course, are just one part of a much larger story, both in terms of the shareholder proposal process generally and in terms of what else was going on in the world. Right? So this era brought really the development of a complex system around shareholder proposals. So the proponents themselves are just one part of a much larger story. I think it's fair to say that this is also part of a larger social cultural moment that was happening in the United States in kind of the late 20-teens, early 2020s. Critics maligned what was happening, supporters loved it. Whether you love it or hate it, I think it's very clear that there was a larger moment going on. Okay? And of course, because some people were unhappy, we got a backlash, right, that responded, because that's what happens with pendulums. They tend to swing back and forth. Right? So starting in about 2022 or so, we started to hear the early parts of this. And then, of course, it picked up steam more recently in 2024, 2025, and onward. So we've seen the emergence of so-called anti-ESG proposals. So for example, Instead of asking for a report on greenhouse gas emissions, you might ask for a report on the risks arising from voluntary carbon reduction commitments. Instead of asking for a report about equal employment outcomes, you might ask for a report on the risks created by the company's DEI projects. Right? Those are the sorts of things that the anti-ESG proposals often involve. We saw a decline in environmental and social proposals. Companies are pushing back more. Voting support has declined. Proxy advisors have been stepping back a little. And of course, there have been some regulatory changes at the SEC. So we'll come back to all of this, I promise. But first, I want to take a half step back and just take a minute to really understand what was happening in that world before we got to the most recent changes. Because that'll help us put into context what might happen going forward. So the first thing I really want to emphasize again is that the vote itself isn't the main event. Right? It's hard to measure withdrawal rates precisely, exactly because these proposals never make it onto the proxy. There is no single consolidated record of everything that was withdrawn and settled, so you have to kind of cobble it together. But research, certainly that Jill and I have done, and that others have done, maybe something in the neighborhood of 40% is a reasonable ballpark. This is really important because a withdrawal coupled with a settlement can deliver exactly what the proponent wants. If you can get what you wanted without having to go to a vote, you should be happy, not unhappy, right? So withdrawal is a measure of success very often, not a failure mode. The vote, in other words, is really not the point. Right? The vote is a byproduct of the corporate governance system happening. The other key thing to remember is that while it's true that tiny shareholders can go out on their own and bring a proposal at a gigantic company, in practice, this is not the norm. Instead, this space is dominated by repeat players and established networks. Right? Nonprofits also play a really important role here. So rather than talking about all this in the abstract, because I know it's kind of late and it's a little warm, instead I'll focus on a specific context to try to make it concrete. Right? So let's talk about this in the context of political proposals. These are proposals seeking disclosure about political activities and lobbying activities. Right? So these are squarely disclosure. You're asking for disclosure. And they're interesting for a number of reasons. So first, they straddle the line between the value and values. You can frame them as agency cost and risk management, and some people do. But you can also frame them as values-driven accountability. You can frame them as money in politics is bad and we want to get it out. Right? And people do both. And that ambiguity makes them a useful lens. They're also high volume and persistent over time. Right? So this is a graph from a different project that Jill Fish and I are working on. And you can see that the number of political proposals at S&P 500 companies, so that's what I'm showing you here, has been consistently quite high. Right? It bops around a little. It was highest in 2015, and then it kind of fell for a couple of years in the heyday of the disclosure sustainability era, that middle era. You're looking at something in the neighborhood of 70 to 90 proposals. Right? And it kind of stayed there, more or less, for many years. So what I've done here is I've broken out into different categories of political proposals. In blue, these political proposals are related specifically to elections and election spending. Right? So these are generally asking for disclosure about those types of contributions and the processes through which companies engage in them. In the red, we have lobbying proposals. Right? These are not about elections, but this is more like what happens after somebody gets elected. Do you spend money lobbying them? In green, we have this much smaller group which focuses specifically on lobbying related to climate. And then finally, we have what are sometimes called alignment proposals. So this is about disclosing the extent to which a company's political activities diverge or are not aligned with the company's stated policies or stated values. Right? And so that's something that grew in the last part of our sample period here. Right? So for example, if a company positions itself as being pro-choice, but it gives money to pro-life candidates, proponents would say that that's a misalignment, and they would ask for disclosure about that kind of thing. Right? And those sort of expanded. Support has also been consistent and meaningful, both in terms of settlements and in terms of votes. Right? And I'll show you more about that in a moment. And then finally, what's nice about them is, outcomes are pretty easy to measure. So that makes our lives a little bit easier as people who are trying to study this process. Okay, so let's take a look at the ecosystem that surrounds these proposals. First thing I want to emphasize, this is not a world of small-scale investors going it alone. That is not really what's going on here. There are instead networks that share information, they strategize together about which companies to target, they coordinate submissions, right? Historically, this could involve sharing information about how to draft a proposal that will be consistent with the SEC's current guidance, so it won't be excluded. It's also, what's likely to get support by proxy advisors, because that way you can try to run up the vote total. So, for example, the ICCR, right, this is one example of a consortium of investors that's very active in this space. Right? This is not a secret that this happens. There's a press release telling the world about the 60 proposals that they were involved with putting out. There are also so-called gadflies, right? Individual investors with small holdings that bring these proposals, even though they are generally part of much larger networks, they're still like an individual person that does this. But you shouldn't mistake them for somebody who wakes up one day and owns some shares in the company and decides to bring a proposal. Right? These are very sophisticated participants who know the process very well. Right? They understand what they're doing. They're known to all the players in the ecosystem. Okay? So when we break this out and we go carefully one by one, we end up with this chart where we categorize all of the proponents in this world by type. And so as you can see, ESG managers are at the top, so that would be something like Walden or Boston Commons. These are asset managers that specialize in sustainability and other forms of ESG investing. Public pension funds are second, so that's like New York State Common or New York City Retirement. Faith investors are third, so faith investors, that's our ICCR. Now, if you look at these proposals individually, right, you see names like, I'm making this up, but like the Benedictine Sisters of St. Michael the Archangel or whatever. I mean, that's what is shown on the proxy, and that's true, that's the proponent. But of course, they're not the nuns going it alone. They're members of these larger consortia, and they're kind of getting together and filing these as a group. A little further down, those are our so-called gadflies. That's Chevedden and McRitchie. So these are just like literally two guys. And we were able to identify 78 proposals with which those two guys were involved. And again, this is not a secret. They're well known in this space, deeply embedded. This is why I was saying it would be a mistake to think of them as investors who kind of woke up one day and decided to do this, because that's not really the right way to think about it. Now, those public pension funds, by the way, in addition to bringing a lot of proposals, they're also casting a lot of votes related to these proposals because they own a lot of shares. And so until quite recently, that was actually true across the board. That was true with respect to all the public pension funds, not just, or at least the ones we looked at, not just the usual suspects. The last thing I want to emphasize are not-for-profits or nonprofits. So Elizabeth Pullman and Mariana Pargendler have a recent excellent paper looking at nonprofits and shaping corporate governance more generally. In our context of political proposals, the most interesting nonprofit that we came across is the Center for Political Accountability. Right? So it's a nonprofit. They play a variety of roles. They collect data about political disclosures at a broad range of companies. They create an index called the CPA-Zicklin Index, and lots of people use it. We used it in our research. They also have a model proposal that proponents can bring. And so while they don't themselves bring proposals, you can easily identify CPA proposals because they're all exactly the same wording. Why? Because they found a language that works, and so why not keep using it? Makes sense. They also work with proponents directly to help them identify laggards and to target proposals to companies. Right? And they also work with companies directly, this is just from their website, to try to get them to change their practices. Right? And they're also seeking policy changes, apparently, according to their website. Right? So this is not, in other words, again, atomized players acting on their own. This is a much deeper ecosystem. Settlement, right? as I said before, it's not really about the vote. The vote is just a byproduct. So settlement plays a key role in this space. So first, we note that withdrawal is really, really common. Right? If you just look at the standard data sources, the standard ISS data that academics use, you actually miss a lot of the settled proposals. So you're going to miss a big part of the iceberg. So that's just one thing that I want to flag. As you can see, right, withdrawals, they're shown in green here. Really significant fraction. It's something like 35 to 37 if you drop the omitted. It's a big chunk of the total number of proposals. Well, why is that significant? Hard to know for sure, but anecdotally, most withdrawn proposals result from a settlement where the proponent is getting some of what they wanted, at least, if not all of it. Getting a commitment is a major victory. The other thing I want to point out is how this changes the overall picture of success. So in red on the far right, that's the average vote in support. But that's only of the proposals that go to a vote. So something like 20s to high 30s, that's respectable, you might think is an average. But that's only of the relatively modest fraction, right, 60% or so, that go to a vote. Once you add in the withdrawals, the numbers look significantly higher. So 2 punchlines here, vote to the tip of the iceberg. And if you just look at proposals that went to a vote, you're missing some of the most successful ones. Our research, the research Jill and I did, supports the idea that withdrawal and settlement is associated with getting something. Right? So these are the results of a regression analysis that we did. We're looking at changes in disclosure after. Right? And what we find basically is companies disclose more of the types of things that are being asked for after there's a vote, but they also do it by a very similar amount after there's a withdrawal. Right? So that's consistent with the idea that, yeah, you're settling, you're getting something of what you asked for. Right? Settlement's not a failure mode. It's often actually the success mode. Okay. Now, all that was under the old regime, right? The ancien regime, if we're talking French. Things are clearly changing. And I think a fair summary of the SEC's actions to date under the current administration are that it's sort of preserving the shareholder proposal rule, at least for the time being, for material company relevant issues, but it's reducing its availability as a generalized policy forum. Right? So 2 key policy changes here have contributed to this. So the first is this staff legal bulletin 14M, because M comes after L, and L was the previous one. What's going on there? That was as of last February. It rescinded that 2021 policy change, so it wound the clock back. And the punchline here is that it's easier for companies to omit proposals that are not sort of core issues. The second is this shift in the no action process. So in November, the SEC announced that for the 2025-26 proxy season, it's not going to respond to no action requests and express no views on companies intended to rely on bases for exclusion other than the proper purpose, right? The proper subject under state law. So in other words, under the change, companies will still have to notify the SEC if they want to exclude the proposal, and the proponent, of course. But the SEC emphasized that there's no need to seek no action relief. If a company does want to do so, then, and it's about a topic other than the proper subject, the company should include an unqualified letter from counsel representing that it has a reasonable basis to exclude, and the SEC will respond automatically based solely on that representation. Right? So that's another significant change. Right? And of course, the SEC has indicated that more changes are to come. Right? So all of that, of course, because we've all been alive recently, has coincided with a pullback, right? A more general pullback by large institutional investors and by proxy advisors. So large institutions are becoming more circumspect about their support for ENS proposals. So Vanguard got a fair amount of attention when it released its summary of the 2025 proxy year. And what did they tell us? Well, it announced that it had not supported any environmental or social proposals in its brief that went out. Right? BlackRock and Vanguard are also both implementing versions of pass-through voting, which will mean that they will be basically leaving voting and decisions to investors. So instead of the asset manager voting, they're going to ask the end investors to make elections about how they want their stuff voted. So that further removes the institutions from the business of voting on these proposals. This is something else that I don't think is surprising if you think about it, but I don't think it's gotten much attention. So this is from a work in progress that Jill and I have. Basically everything I do that's of any interest to people is stuff I do with Jill. So previously, even red state pension funds were pretty supportive of E&S proposals, and that started to change in the early 2020s. So this is the Florida SBA, which manages the Florida State Retirement System. And so, as you can see, support for environmental in green and social in red, those proposals, the support for those was hovering around 60% around 2021 until then. It starts to drop after that. And by 2025, the environmental ones are close to zero. There's a little more support for the social proposals, but some of those might be anti-ESG proposals, I don't know. And it's certainly gone down. Support for governance proposals, on the other hand, stayed really strong, right? Stayed around 90%. And this is not just Florida. So here's Texas. So this is the teacher retirement system of Texas. Right? Similar sort of thing, right? The timing's a little different just because of data availability here. But environmental proposals also started dropping after 2021 and bottomed out at zero. It's just the two lines exactly overlap. Social started to fall a year later and again sort of bottomed out. Governance proposals have stayed around 60% or so. I think that's an important part of the story. Why? Because pension funds, they control a lot of shares too. Maybe what's more interesting is that they used to support these things, not so much that they've stopped, given what states they're located in. Okay. Another piece of the story, of course, is that proxy advisors are stepping back from this space. Corporate boards are also more willing to push back, both through the traditional means of seeking no action relief for omissions, and also through maybe more unconventional means of pushing back, right? So maybe the most widely noticed example was when ExxonMobil sued two of its investors, two of its shareholders in federal court, to stop them from bringing proposals seeking stronger greenhouse gas emission targets. That sparked investor backlash, but arguably it was successful for Exxon. So Arjuna Capital, one of the two proponents, provided a formal covenant promising not to submit similar climate-related proposals at Exxon in the future. The other one was a foreign entity, and so the court found it had no jurisdiction. So, with all of that in mind, what happened in 2025? Right, the punchline was things looked a little different from how they looked during the previous era. Right? Variety of different organizations collect and publish this. They're not identical because they have slightly different samples, but it all points in a pretty consistent direction. Decline in submissions, right? The largest decline was among social and environmental proposals. We had a high watermark for anti-ESG proposals. A spike in omissions, right? So requests for no action relief jump, and that was especially true after the new guidance was provided by the SEC partway through proxy season. Decline in overall voting support, right? Large drops, especially for DEI and environmental proposals. Classic governance, right? Old-fashioned, separate the board and the CEO, de-stagger the board, that kind of thing. And political proposals, actually. Support stayed strong for political proposals. This is consistent with the pattern we saw at those pension funds, where even the red state pension funds are continuing to support governance proposals. And again, I think it's clear that we should expect to see more changes over the next couple of years. Okay? So, like what? Well, there are two broad avenues I'd like to touch on. The first relates to the legal foundation of precatory proposals. Specifically, the question of whether precatory proposals, right, asking the board to think about doing something or maybe put together a report, whether that's a proper subject for shareholder action. So we've already seen that you can only bring a proposal if it's a proper subject for action under state law. So Chairman Atkins raised this, he flagged this issue at a speech he gave in the fall, and in doing so, he pointed to an article written by a Delaware lawyer discussing this in the context of Delaware. Right? So presumably, state law is going to provide the answer here, and we may get more clarity on that. He also mentioned the fact that Texas has enacted an opt-in statutory regime that raises the bar for shareholder proposals at certain Texas-linked corporations, right? So I think there you'd have to hold at least $1 million in shares, or 3%, in order to bring a shareholder proposal. And Chairman Atkins expressed the view that the higher threshold under Texas law would preempt the lower threshold under the shareholder proposal rule. So because the shareholder proposal rule only facilitates what exists at state law, if the state law has a higher threshold, the logic goes, then the higher threshold is what governs. So that's sort of an indirect effect on the rule, but it goes to that fact that this is a bridge between those two areas of law. Okay? The second is a direct change, potentially. So if you look, a feature of federal administrative law in the United States is there is this thing called the rulemaking agenda, and you can see the sorts of things that agencies are thinking about doing. And so the SEC's rulemaking agenda includes an entry for shareholder proposal modernization. To be sure, it's not binding, right? It's just sort of a heads up about what agencies are thinking. So I certainly, it's not fair to say that they're committed to doing anything here. And even if they were, it's unclear what that change would be, but it is possible that we'll see a notice of proposed rulemaking, and that'll be exciting. Could be anything from a minor tweak to a full-blown repeal to anything in between. Right, so stay tuned on that. Now, given that it's too early to say what that's going to look like, and it could be anything, it's understandable that people are concerned. So what I want to do is think about what might happen in a world with the biggest possible change. Not because I think that's necessarily the most likely outcome, but because it's the biggest departure from the status quo, right? And so if we think about that world, then we should feel like we understand the full universe of what could happen. So what I want to do is suggest that even if that were to happen, it is not the end of the world, right? To be sure, things would change, right? The ability of shareholders to force companies to carry their message, that would go away, right, if the proposal rule went away. The fact that shareholders and shareholder groups can use the proxy, right, the company's document, to get their message out at minimal cost, that would go away. And of course, the particular method would, by assumption, go away. It's not nothing, but as I want to come back to in a moment, there are lots and lots of other means of corporate governance that would remain available. So which players are most likely, if we had to stop and think through what the implications of this would be, who's going to be most affected? Well, presumably the incumbents that have developed those ecosystems, those networks, right, and those workflows around a current rule. It's going to be disruptive if there's a major change to the way you've been functioning. Maybe some of the nonprofits that have developed specific expertise, it might be kind of disruptive to them. Maybe some of the small proponents that have figured out ways to operate in the system as it existed. You can see that being disruptive to them. Right? So I don't want to say that there's going to be nothing, but notwithstanding this, a lot of levers of corporate governance would remain largely unaffected. Right? So here's how I would sort of summarize the alternatives. And these are kind of loosely in ascending order of intensity. So the first is just classic shareholder voice. This is old-fashioned engagement. Right? Nothing in the world stops shareholders from meeting with management. Even without, you don't need a shareholder proposal to meet with management. And the more shares you own, the more likely management is to pick up the phone when you call them. There's an even older approach, which is writing a letter to the chairman of the board. Right? There's nothing in the world that stops you from being able to write a letter to the chairman. Even I could write a letter to the chairman of the board. Right? Remember, a huge amount of the impact of shareholder proposals comes through negotiated withdrawals. Nothing in the world stops you from asking the same thing that you can ask now, especially since the proposals were only ever precatory to begin with. It was only ever a request and a suggestion. One level up from that is voting, right? Specifically voting on the other things that are on the ballot, director elections, say on pay, management proposals. Remember, it was always precatory to begin with, and the real stick was always, well, if you don't do what we ask, we might vote against management on other things. Well, those other things aren't going away. State corporate law still requires director elections. So the standard tools of corporate governance are not changing. Those votes will still have to happen. right? They're still going to be on the ballot, and there's nothing in the world that stops shareholders from expressing their unhappiness with management for whatever reason they're unhappy, right? Using the same tools that they always had. And of course, that can escalate to traditional activism, right? Those tools are still there. If a shareholder is really unhappy with the board for any reason, the availability of proxy contests, right? You can always bring a proxy contest. And especially with the universal proxy, right? In the last couple of years, it's become cheaper than it's ever been and easier than it's ever been to mount a proxy contest. Traditional corporate governance is not going away. If you don't like that, there are other types of campaigns, right, that shareholders are free to mount, like, say, a withhold campaign, right, and other state law avenues may be available. Speaking of state law, the next level up, what I called here hard power, you can think of this as kind of state law, other rights. So, for example, if applicable, right, there's nothing about the shareholder proposal rule that says anything about a shareholder's right to make books and records requests, right, which might be available at state law, like Delaware 220 books and records requests. Right? That's a separate area. It has nothing to do with shareholder proposals. In certain extreme cases of governance breaches, there may also be causes of action under state law. And of course, there's always exit, right? If you're really unhappy as a shareholder, you can always just walk away. You can sell. You can either sell directly, or you can, do a partial divestment, sell some of your shares. Nothing's going to happen to that. To be sure, right, there's costs of some of these, and some of them are more costly than others. That's why you can think of this as kind of escalating. And there are potential pitfalls to be aware of. You have to be careful that you're not acting as a group or soliciting for proxies or becoming, a 13D filer if you're being too active. Antitrust concerns if you're cooperating too closely with competitors, things like that. But, careful investors, you shouldn't be an issue for most of these things. So, I know I'm short on time. I saw the 2-minute thing flash by about 2 minutes ago, so I don't want to go over time. So let me go to the conclusion here. And here's the final takeaway. Proposals, I would suggest to you, they're an agenda-setting and information mechanism. It's not just about the vote. What that means is whatever happens, even in the most extreme case where a vote goes away, corporate governance mechanisms are not going away. Right? They just might evolve. And this is a system that has been evolving for decades. It's just another step in the evolution. Traditional corporate governance is still available to investors that have something to say to management, whatever it is that they have to say. That interplay between state law and the securities law is just going to keep reshaping the proposal space. And so whatever happens, many levers will remain available to shareholders. So with that, I will call it a night and take questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Robertson, for that rich and thought-provoking lecture. Your presentation has certainly offered a compelling account of how shareholder proposals have evolved over time. The regulatory and political dynamics shaping their current use, and indeed the future of shareholder proposals, and of course alternative mechanisms that may be available to shareholders to make their voice heard, and of course to influence corporate accountability. We will now move on to the moderated discussion and the Q&A segment of this evening. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening, Mr. Teck Tiong, who is partner and co-head of the Sustainability and Responsible Business Practice at Wong Partnership. Tiong advises leading corporations and financial institutions on sustainability-related governance, disclosure, and regulatory matters, and brings deep practical insight into how shareholder proposals are engaged within boardrooms, investment decision-making, and regulatory practice. He is therefore undoubtedly exceptionally well-placed to moderate this discussion and to bring the enriching academic insights to real-world experience. So may I now invite Professor Robertson and Tiong to come forward and please be seated for the moderated discussion. And as they take their seats, I would like to just make a quick note on how you can participate in this session. You will see that there is a QR code being displayed, so please feel free to scan it whether you're here or joining us online, and type in your questions or comments. And of course, if you prefer to go old school, please feel free to raise your hands and we will be happy to pass the microphone over to you. Tiong, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, so hi everyone. Thanks for coming to today's lecture, and thanks of course to Adriana for the very thought-provoking and engaging lecture that she just gave. So now we'll move on to the Q&A session. But before that, I think I was asked to share sort of some of my thoughts from an Asian perspective as to how shareholder proposals work in this part of the world. I think first and foremost, Asia is very hard to describe in any context in a homogeneous fashion, right? In any context at all, right? Corporate law in many countries, India, Singapore, Australia, Hong Kong, China, it's all different, right? But I think generally based on what we have seen, there are some trends that can be drawn as to the use of the equivalent of shareholder proposals under Asian company law. So the question that's often asked is, why do we not see more of the same sort of shareholder activism that we see in Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-American countries in Asia? And I think it comes down to a few things, right? And these are just my personal thoughts. I have not done the sort of in-depth empirical study that Adriana has, right? So this is by and large based on talking to people in the industry and understanding what's going on in boardrooms in companies in Asia. So I think it could potentially come down to a few things. One is the more concentrated shareholding structure of Asian companies, as I think Victor alluded to when he gave his opening remarks. And that's complicated by the fact that in the concentrated shareholding structure, a lot of them are institutional investors, a lot of them are large corporations investing in other large corporations. So that brings to mind the phrase that do unto others what you want others to do unto you, right? So if you're going to run into someone else's company as the majority shareholder and start kicking up a fuss about ESG policies, corporate governance, then expect the same to be done to you, right? So a combination of concentrated shareholder structure plus large percentage of institution and large corporation investing in each other. And the second thing is perhaps differences in legal frameworks. So to be frank, in most Asian countries, we don't really have the sort of shareholder proposal concept that we have in the US. We have shareholder requisitions, but those result in binding votes. So if you say you hold more than 5% or 10%, depending on which provision of the Company Act in Singapore you're going under, you raise a motion for vote at the agenda. If you get the requisite vote, it binds the company, it binds the board. It's not precatory, it's not a suggestion, it's not an encouragement to action. It is a legally binding commitment. And we don't sort of have like a more nuanced mechanism like shareholder proposals in the US where people can engage at a less aggressive, shareholders and boards can engage at a less aggressive level, right? And I think the third and final point I'll add is that there is also a cultural element to it. There's also a cultural element to it in terms of how we interact with each other socially, how we interact with each other in business practices. It tends to be a bit more, it tends to be less aggressive, tends to be more conciliatory, tends to be more consensus-based. So we tend to see less of these sorts of aggressive actions, and to the extent also that we also see less shareholder action being brought against companies and courts for a whole host of other issues. But that being said, I think there are some changes on the horizon. You see shareholders banding together more and more, not necessarily in the ESG or sustainability context, but in corporate governance context to try to remove boards whose management they're not happy with. There's been a spate of litigation in court. The SGX is considering introducing new provisions in the listing rules to actually mandate that companies must assist shareholders who want to raise requisitions, because a lot of the litigation has been around how companies have been trying through logistical, administrative means to block requisitionists. So that's just some thoughts from me. This session is not for me to give a part 2 of the lecture. It's for all of you, both online and in person here, to raise the questions that you have. So Does anyone present in the audience have any questions before I go on to the many questions that have come in online?
Yeah, so thank you so much for that engaging and interesting lecture. So I'm just wondering, from my Asian perspective, Singaporean perspective, it's actually quite alarming to have this mechanism because from a corporate, I used to work in a company and I used to be in the legal department and the idea that anyone can just send a proposal and we have to deal with it, that sort of creates a whole department to deal with these requests. So it's very, very costly. But from your research, have you, notwithstanding the cost that it may incur, have you found real benefits to this whole practice? Is that something that's empirically established? Thanks.
So you are describing very well the position that skeptics of the rule articulate, which is this is really expensive for companies to have to manage, and indeed it's something that the corporate secretary has to deal with, and you need lawyers to blah, 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 all the things. And in addition to that, the concern is this is a distraction that takes management away from actually running the company, and you have to hire people and do all these things, which hurts the other shareholders that are, frankly, just there to make money. Right? So that is exactly the argument that is articulated. And the question of, are these things actually good in the long run, as I was sort of trying to allude to, there's tons of empirical research that people try to do, but it's really hard to actually assess the causal impact one way or the other, because companies that get shareholder proposals are not random, right? They're picked for a particular reason. And so you might think that shareholders are going to pick the most problematic companies, maybe, but then it's not because they got the proposal that there's a problem, it's because they got it's the other way around, right? And similarly, you might think that, well, when lots of shareholders vote one way on a proposal, it's because those shareholders are also just generally mad. And so it's really hard to assess the causal impact of these things. So there are papers out there, and they kind of go in very different directions. Some of them say support for sort of governance proposals is actually bad for shareholder value. But again, it's very hard to get real causal identification on these things. There's no doubt that there's a lot of them. There has been a lot of them over the years, and there's no doubt that people do pay some attention to them. So that's why they're still kind of worth talking about, I think. But in terms of the direction of the causal impact, it's a bit tough to know for sure.
Thanks a lot for your talk. I'm actually from the U.S., so recently moved to Singapore. Chicago, actually. I went to Northwestern, so the other school.
You can still stay.
But my question was two parts. I had two questions, I guess. So the first one is, with the increasing politicization in the U.S., are you seeing people with certain political affiliations use shareholder proposals to kind of showcase their anti-woke, anti-DEI kind of mechanisms to try to get these companies to publicly say one way or the other where they stand? That's one question. And the other is, are companies also, through these shareholder proposals, facing corporate espionage as well, where there's, as you said, there's a lot of costs involved with these proposals, or they have to make some kind of statement when these things come to a vote. So are there competitor companies that try to use shareholder proposals to try to make companies say a statement to then, create some kind of reputational damage or something like that?
That's even more devious than the stuff I'm used to hearing. I'm not aware of any sort of false flag shareholder proposals, but I mean, I guess in theory it could happen. I've never heard that discussed, but I kind of almost hope somebody's tried it, because otherwise it's like the $20 bill on the floor that nobody picked up. And as somebody at Chicago, that makes me feel nervous when there's a $20 bill left on the floor. On your first question about the anti-ESG proposal, that's what we refer to. They're typically known as anti-ESG proposals. So yes, the answer is yes. People have been doing this for the last couple of years. The number of them has been rising over time. And often they take a similar form. And so it's, again, usually asking for a report or asking for some kind of suggestion, so still precatory. And usually it's something like, consider the risks associated with not having enough viewpoint diversity. That's one example of a relatively kind of common. Or consider the risks associated with your greenhouse gas reduction targets, right? Because after all, for certain kinds of companies, that might hurt shareholder value. We want you to think about it. That sort of thing is becoming increasingly common. There's a couple of proponent groups that bring them that are sort of prominent groups, and that's what they've been doing. They typically have not gotten a ton of shareholder support yet, but who knows what's going to happen going forward.
So let's give our online audience a chance. So I think a trend that has emerged in some of the questions I'm seeing here is the future of shareholder proposals and the future of ESG and the intersection of the two in the US, right? Because we are talking about anti-ESG shareholder proposals growing in number. We are talking about the backlash. Could you perhaps tell us more about where do you see this going? We saw from your lecture that there is a trend upwards on that in 2025. What do you think is going to happen 2026, 2027, and onwards?
Well, as I said, there may well be regulatory changes that are going to happen in the meantime, and so that obviously is going to have a huge impact. At the extreme, if it were to happen that the entire rule was repealed, then I have a very strong prediction of what's going to happen. There will be no shareholder proposals, because in a world with no shareholder proposals, there will be no shareholder proposals. It seems plausible that if there are amendments that are passed that also make it harder to bring proposals, then we would expect there to be fewer of them. I think even without significant regulatory change in time for next proxy season, given the other factors that are already in the environment, I think it is fair to say that it is not presently a favorable environment for ESG-based shareholder proposals. As I mentioned, there's sort of been pullbacks by proxy advisors. And remember, proponents wanted to tailor their proposals so that proxy advisors would recommend in favor, because after all, that's a good way to maximize the vote share for your proposal. But the proxy advisors are largely backing away from this business. They don't really want to be in the business of recommending whether to vote yes or no on ESG proposals. So if they kind of back away from it, as we get more and more shares that are being voted through pass-through voting, depending on what's going to happen there, but if a big chunk of the shares that BlackRock and Vanguard control are no longer being cast by the stewardship team at BlackRock and Vanguard, and it becomes much harder to predict what's going to happen there. So I would say, obviously, there's a lot of unknowns. I wouldn't want to state with any degree of certainty what's going to happen in the next couple of years, but I certainly do not think it looks favorable.
So just to pick up the point on the SEC, the contemplated amendments by the SEC, how is that process playing out? Are we seeing consultation with stakeholders? Where is the SEC's head at the present moment?
So I have no private information. I
was hoping you had.
I have the regulatory agenda, so it's like a public document that this is something that's being considered. I also think Chairman Atkins was, it was no secret. He gave a public speech where he talked about the shareholder proposals, and he talked about this issue of a proper subject for action. There's been many signals that the Commission is looking at this, and I think, again, it doesn't take a crystal ball to look at those signals and suggest that at least they did not necessarily agree with the approach that was being taken under the previous administration, but how far it's going to go is still open. I think, ask me again in 2028, I'll have a clearer answer.
So let's come back to the people in the room. Anyone has a question?
It's truly fascinating. I learned a lot. Actually, I do research in corporate governance. I studied shareholder proposals for a while, but not the past few years. So I can give the audience one example, how costly a shareholder proposal can be. So I will illustrate the other side after that. I have an old friend who is 94 years old right now. He used to be the CEO of Fortune 100 company. And he has one enemy, her name starts with E, and she tends to give shareholder proposals year after year, which, based on my friend CEO, this is kind of a nuisance, right? And so she came to the CEO's office to say, I have this proposal, and the CEO said, can you stay away from my praxis? And she said, if you subscribe 10,000 of my newsletters, I will stay away from this year. But that's an extreme case. I don't think that's representative in any way. But there are some nuanced shareholder proposal. But I do agree with the discussion in general, like maybe the equilibrium past in the past few years is not exactly at the economic trade-off of the benefit and cost. Maybe we are in the process making adjustment. I don't know whether the current status is the right equilibrium, most likely not. Actually, when you talk about the steward teams, many of those teams are dissolved, or 80% of those people are dismissed at this point. Is the large, voices there, they're gone. So essentially, are we going to a better equilibrium? I'm not sure, perhaps not. I think the pendulum is swinging a little bit too much in the other direction, right? So at which point, how can we trade off the benefit and cost? How can we make this system work? I think what you said, I agree. In 2028, we may see more. But in the meantime, we still have many existing tools. A director re-election, that happens every single year for many companies, right? You can always cast your vote. If you're not happy with directors, if they're on the nominating committee, they're on the governance committee, they're on the whatever audit committee, you can always withhold your vote. And those are the means that we always had for so many years, and they are the most effective one because those are the proposals, mandatory. Those are the praxis, right? Nobody can take them away. So I think these are probably still the mechanism that we can rely on. But I think this is super useful discussion, and this is very timely. I'm very happy to hear more from the audience, both online and in this room. Thank you.
So we actually have a question online that follows on from what has just been said, which is the question of the other tools that are available to shareholders, right? So those tend to be a lot less, compared to shareholder proposals, tend to be a lot less public and a lot less publicized as well. Do you think? And would you think that they would be equally effective as shareholder proposals in garnering attention or raising awareness about the issues that shareholders, nonprofits, funds try to use precatory proposals to garner attention over?
Well, I think it depends. I don't think a proxy contest is quiet. I mean, I think some of those are much louder than shareholder proposals, right? So, and when it comes to a letter, I mean, yeah, I guess if you wrote a letter and sent it in the mail and never told anyone about it, it wouldn't be very public, but there's nothing that stops you from putting out a press release, and there's nothing that stops you from writing an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and the Wall Street Journal somebody is likely to run it if you're a large investor and you have something important to say, or I don't know, these days, like, everybody and their cat seems to have a Substack. So, like, there's nothing that stops you from publicizing, just on and that was the lowest hanging fruit. That was writing a letter. As you go up the line, I certainly don't think that there's anything quiet about a proxy contest. And then when it comes to exit, you can loudly exit. And if you're a big investor, your holdings are followed closely, and you would get headlines. I would imagine there would be headlines in the financial press if a large, sustainability-based investor said, you know what, we're divesting all of our holdings of company XYZ. That would be a really credible signal that you really feel strongly about this. So I'm not so sure that these are less noticeable. They might be a little bit more costly in the sense that you have to put your money where your mouth is, but maybe that makes them louder and more effective.
Thanks for that. So coming back to the room, I think we're down to the last couple of minutes. So coming back to the room.
I'm wondering if you have information on the correlation between the type of sector the firms are in and proposals on ESG. For example, if you're in clothing or sportswear, or if you happen to be Ben & Jerry's, I would expect that there would be more proposals simply because they'd be more sensitive to the issue raised in the public. And there would therefore be a link between shareholder activism and consumer activism.
So not Ben & Jerry's, because they're a subsidiary of another company. But yes, in general, there is consumer-facing companies for whatever reason. Like consumer-facing tends to get a lot more attention than non-consumer-facing. Because as we all know, if you actually look at the list of S&P 500 companies, there's a lot of companies that 98% of people have never heard of, even among the largest companies that are listed. But the ones that people have heard of are the ones that tend to get more proposals. Then, of course, in particular, obviously energy companies tend to get more environmental proposals. That's maybe not surprising. But you also get a lot of proposals that, at least in my view, are not at well-known companies like, say, Amazon or Meta or Alphabet, like the companies that everybody in the world has heard of because they're really big and they're really prominent and consumers use them every day. They tend to get just wildly disproportionate numbers of proposals relative to sort of other companies that you might think are similar in sort of material ways. And that suggests that, to your point, these are based on what people have heard of often. Seems like. At least there seems to be a relationship there.
Maybe one last question from the floor. Here we have.
Thanks very much. I was just very curious about some of your graphs, like you had the categories. How would you define climate, for example? Because climate can be very, very narrow in terms of like climate change, or it could be as broad as Google and their data centers and its impact on environment. And also, you also had one that said omitted. Maybe could you please share a bit more about what you mean by omitted, please? Thanks.
Yeah, so omitted, those are the proposals where the company says, we think that this is not following the rules for whatever reason, so we ask the SEC for no action relief, typically. And then the SEC writes back, and then you omit it from the proposal. So that you might think of as like a failure, right? You submitted a proposal, and it's not that it was withdrawn, it's that the company said, we don't want to have to include this, and the SEC agreed. And if that's the part where now there's been a slight change to that process, making it probably a little bit easier maybe going forward, or at least the SEC is kind of stepping back from refereeing that process, which means that to the extent that proponents disagree with the conclusion, it'll have to go to the courts. It's not going to be the SEC's job, for the moment at least, to do that. In terms of what counts as environmental and social, I totally agree that this is like a super fuzzy area. That's actually why with that first graph I showed you with just the numbers, I don't know if you know, I just had governance and then environmental and social because I was making that graph a few weeks ago for my slides, and there were a whole bunch of these proposals where I was like, I don't know, is this environmental or is this social or is it both? And I don't want my graph to be subjective, so I just collapsed them into one thing. Now you can also say, well, some of them maybe they're also kind of governance-y, and I accept that, but I still wanted to show something, and so that's why I did it. But I completely agree that they're not, it's not a sharp line between them.
So if there are no more questions from the floor, I think we can bring this Q&A session to a close, which just leaves all of us to thank Adriana and all of you for your active participation in today's Q&A session and lecture.
Thank you very much, Professor Robertson and Teck for a highly engaging discussion. To express our appreciation, for your valuable contributions to this lecture. I would like to now invite Professor Jun Yang, the Dean of the Nanyang Business School and President's Chair in Finance, to present tokens of appreciation to our distinguished speakers. Before we conclude, I would like to invite you all to join us at our next lecture in the series on the 14th of April 2026 at 9 p.m. Singapore time. So I believe this is happening virtually, where we will have the opportunity of hearing Professor Jeffrey G. York, Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship at the Leeds School of Business, University of Colorado, Boulder, with the discussion moderated by Alina Trujina, founder and managing partner of Utopia Capital. The lecture is titled Environmental Entrepreneurship from Idea to Adoption. So you may scan the QR code on the slide to register and stay updated about our upcoming events. This brings us to the close of our session today. My sincere thanks to Professor Robertson and to Mr. Teck Tiong for guiding the discussion so thoughtfully today. I would also like to thank our audience, both in Singapore as well as those joining from overseas, for being with us this evening and for engaging with us. And of course, I would like to extend my gratitude to the organizing team who has put in tremendous effort to bring this event to fruition. Thank you. Finally, we would be greatly appreciative if you could take a moment to complete the feedback survey, which I believe is accessible via this QR code. Please scan the QR code and give us your feedback, because we take your feedback seriously to improve the series and of course plan future events like this. Thank you very much for being with us this evening. Have a pleasant evening. Thank you.